Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, on yesterday's live stream, and if you haven't seen it, it is available. You can watch all 3 hours. It was a great conversation. We had like 1,000 people in the chat at any given time, and we had a lot of fun, so I hope you check it out. In that stream, we talked about how there are certain gaps in history, right? You know, we tend to focus on big events and don't really always focus on what happens in between. And in American history, we talk a lot about the American Revolution and the Constitution and the founding of the country. And then you get into like the middle of the 1800s, like the time period between, say, Andrew Jackson and the American Civil War. And there's not a lot that we talk about, just besides like things like the Missouri Compromise and, you know, Kansas-Nebraska Act, stuff like that. But we don't talk a lot about the Mexican-American War other than to talk about it in the context of the American Civil War, because it is all connected. All of history is connected. So I thought today we would take a look at the channel Knowledgia and take a look at their video on the Mexican-American War explained in 16 minutes. Now, I haven't covered this war much on the channel. In fact, I went back and looked, and the closest thing you come to that is probably one of my least viewed videos, because it was one of the very first videos I ever did. And I'm going to pin it down in the comment section below if you want to check it out. It's the Mexican-American War rosters, where I actually went through the rosters of all the officers that fought in Mexico to show you how many of these future Civil War generals were fighting side by side. So just to give you one example of that, there was one artillery unit that I was looking at, and there were like 6 guys who ended up corps commanders or higher who were serving as first lieutenants in the same regiment. It was crazy. So that just gives you a little bit of a insight. I'm just looking at the screen right now, and I'm looking at Edward Ord, William Tecumseh Sherman, George Thomas, John Reynolds, and I think that's it. They were all Samuel French, all first lieutenants in the same regiment in Mexico. Just one of those regiments. It was crazy. So Ambrose Burnside was a second lieutenant in that same regiment, the 3rd Regiment of Artillery. So I'm going to pin that video down in the comment section if you want to watch it. It's just really me just reading through and showing you the rosters, just so you can see how all of this was leading up to the American Civil War. That this war, this Mexican-American War, not only greatly expanded the size of the United States and eventually kind of settled the southern and southwestern borders of the United States, but it also prepared an entire generation of generals who were going to lead in the next war less than 2 decades later. So with that in mind, I'll put the link down in the description to the original content. And I want to say thank you to Randall. I know Randall's always showing up in the chat on live streams and leaves a lot of comments. I appreciate all your support and your support now on Patreon. Randall, thank you very much for that. He's in Norwood, North Carolina. Hope all is well for you. Let's dive into this one.
It is the year of 1830. Even though Mexico got its independence some years earlier in 1821 from Spain after a revolution and an armed conflict which lasted over a decade, the country was in total chaos.
And it makes a great point. Typically, at least from the American perspective, when we talk about the events that lead to the American expansion into the Southwest, we typically start with the Alamo, right? 1836. But it really goes back before that. And Mexico has not been its own country for very long. I mean, we're talking basically a little over a decade, and then you're at war in your own country dealing with your own rebellion with Texas. And then, of course, another decade after that, war with the United States. So I sometimes wonder what would the future of Mexico have been had it not been for the Texas War for Independence. How could things have gone differently if the United States doesn't have this manifest destiny idea of taking all of this land? What if all of this stayed in Mexican hands? That'd be a really interesting alternate history to take a look at sometime.
Looking at the map of that time, we can see a larger Mexico than the one we know today. a stretched country, one of the biggest at that time.
Yeah.
The newly independent nation was in dire straits after 11 years of war. No plans or guidelines were established by the revolutionaries, so internal struggles for control of the government ensued. Mexico suffered a complete lack of funds to organize a country of around 4.5 million square kilometers.
Yeah, it's not nearly populated enough to be able to fill that, which is why you have the vacuum that allows for all of these American settlers to start coming into Texas. And with them, many of them coming from the American South where slavery was legal, they're coming into a place where slavery is not legal. And that's going to start to cause some of the conflict that's going to rip Texas apart from the rest of Mexico. And we talk about this all the time. When you are fighting against another opponent, in this case, Mexico was fighting again to break free from Spain, everybody's united. But the minute they win that victory, now what? Now we start facing each other and we start trying to fight over what our country is going to be.
At that time, Mexico faced the threats of emerging internal rebellions and of invasion by Spanish forces from their base in nearby Cuba. This government was characterized by instability, and it was ill-prepared for international conflict when war with the Americans broke out only 2 decades later in 1846. The United States was in expansion, and the country was much bigger than it was when it became independent. The United States of America expanded deeper into the Native American territories, and they purchased the huge Louisiana territory from the French. Although the country was expanding, there was an opportunity for more.
And again, this goes back, if you're not familiar with it, manifest destiny is this idea that goes all the way back to the late part of the 18th century when the United States first becomes a nation. From the very beginning, there was always this idea that we are destined to control the entire continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And that wasn't just from east to west. I mean, there's always eyes on Canada. That's why in the Revolution they're invading Canada. That's why in the War of 1812 they're invading Canada. And they're always looking to the south as well. And you could see scenarios where, had it worked out, where the Caribbean would have, Ulysses S. Grant gets a deal in place to actually acquire what is now the Dominican Republic, and had the Senate signed off on it, that would have been expansion. You could see Cuba having come into American hands during war with Spain. Puerto Rico does come into American hands. So there's always this idea of expansion in the continent.
Due to Mexico's internal problems, several regions rebelled and tried to break away. Texas gained its independence from Mexico in 1836. Initially, the United States declined to incorporate it into the Union, largely because northern political interests were against the addition of a new slave state.
Everything in the United States in its history has to be seen through the lens, in particular, of 2 things: manifest destiny and slavery. The expansion of slavery, new states being added, it's always the overarching issue is, are we going to add a new slave state? Well, that's 2 new senators representing slave interests. What are we going to do in the North to balance that? And so that is what initially keeps Texas from joining the Union, until they can figure out a way to add Texas while simultaneously adding something to balance it in the North.
The Mexican government was also encouraging border raids and warning that any attempt at annexation would lead to war, since the Mexicans still considered Texas as part of their land. Nonetheless, annexation procedures were quickly initiated after the 1844 election of Polk, who campaigned that Texas should be re-annexed and that the Oregon Territory should be reoccupied. Polk also had his eyes on California, New Mexico, and the rest of what is today the U.S. Southwest.
James Knox Polk, he's a Tennessee guy. He's a pro-slavery guy, and he is only going to serve for just the 1 term, but a very, very consequential term, one of the most important presidential terms in all of American history because of these events that unfold.
Looking to expand, Polk offered to purchase those lands, but the offer was rejected. And soon after,
the irony here is that the amount of money that they offer Mexico for the land, in hindsight, would have been a great deal for Mexico, because in the end, they fight a war, they lose, and then they lose the land anyway at a fraction of the price.
He instigated conflict by moving troops into a disputed zone between the Rio Grande and Nueces River that both countries had previously recognized as part of the Mexican state of Coahuila. The tension grew more and more over the disputed lands.
And all of this is going to be Polk picking a fight. I mean, this is one of those scenarios that you see throughout history where the United States wants to take this territory. They're willing to buy it. Can't buy it. Okay, now we're going to have to fight over it. But we can't be seen as the aggressor, so we're going to try and make Mexico make the first move if we can.
Texas was annexed by the United States on December 29, 1845, and became the 28th state. However, the United States inherited the southern and western border dispute with Mexico, which had refused to recognize Texas's independence or the U.S.'s offers to purchase the territory. Thus, through this act, the tensions between the two countries transformed into a war. On April 25, 1846, Mexican cavalry attacked a group of U.S. soldiers in the disputed zone under the command of General Zachary Taylor, killing about a dozen.
And this was a scenario where the Americans knew what would happen, right? This is disputed territory. We're going to send our military into the disputed territory, knowing that Mexico is going to respond. And when they respond, we can say, well, that was our territory. Mexico just invaded us. Now we need to go deal with them.
Laid siege to an American fort along the Rio Grande. Taylor called in reinforcements and was able to defeat the Mexicans at the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. Following those battles, Polk told the U.S. Congress that the cup of forbearance had been exhausted even before Mexico passed the boundary of the United States, invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil.
This was all intentional. They knew this would happen. And this is why Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, who's in the 4th Infantry, and who will end up going south as part of Zachary Taylor's army. He highly looked up to Zachary Taylor, by the way. He felt like and Grant was a quartermaster during part of this time. And he thought that Taylor had one of the most efficient and just effective fighting forces he had ever seen. And yet, Grant felt that this was a completely unjust war. He saw this for what it was, which was a war of conquest. It was a war of aggression to take territory, and he was really uncomfortable with it. But he was a soldier, and he did his duty.
On May 13th, Congress declared war, while no official declaration of war ever came from Mexico. In terms of how the war began, the situation is debatable. We have an ill-prepared Mexico with internal revolts and an emerging power that looks to expand more and more. Mexico was weaker, but the U.S. did not want to look like a bully.
Right.
Even so, Ulysses S. Grant, who had opposed the war but served as an army lieutenant in Taylor's army, claims in his personal memoirs that the main goal of the U.S. Army's advance from the Nueces River to the Rio Grande was to provoke the outbreak of war without attacking first, to debilitate any political opposition to the
100%
war.
right. 100% right.
After Mexican independence, there was a man, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, a controversial character who in the first place didn't support Mexican independence from Spain, but then fought in support of it. He then backed the monarchy of the Mexican Empire, then revolted against the emperor.
This is a political opportunist. This is a guy who seeks power, whether that's military power or political power, and in many cases both. This is the same Santa Anna who wipes out the garrison at the Alamo, but then to save his own skin, signs Texas away at the end when he's captured at the Battle of San Jacinto. And he's going to play a big role in all this, once again, taking advantage of the situation.
And then supported a republic. The country tried to find its path, and these shocks led to more trouble and weakness over time. Santa Anna served 12 non-consecutive presidential terms over a period of 22 years. After the U.S. declared war on Mexico in 1846, an internal coalition, including forced-out President Mariano Paredes, sought a return to a federal republic with Santa Anna as the president. He wrote a letter to Mexico City stating he did not care to return to the presidency, but would like to come out of exile in Cuba to use his military experience to reclaim Texas for Mexico.
You liar. You outright liar. I mean, there's no good guys in all of this. The United States government picks a fight to get a war so they can take all the territory. Santa Anna flat out lies and says, I just want to help. Yeah, we'll see what happens when you get there.
President Valentin Gomez Farias, driven to desperation, accepted the offer and allowed Santa Anna. What was unknown for the current President Farias is that Santa Anna has been secretly dealing with U.S. representatives to sell all contested territory to the U.S. at a reasonable price, on the condition that he be allowed back in Mexico through the U.S. naval blockades.
He's lying to them too. He's lying to everybody. He just wants power.
And so Santa Anna returned to Mexico, taking his place at the head of the army. Once in this powerful position, he went back on his word, declaring himself president and prepared to fight off the U.S. forces' invasion. The Americans achieved...
So, think about this. He tells the Mexican government, I don't want to take over as president. I just want to come help, give my military experience. And they're like, all right, fine. He tells the American government, listen, just get me back in the country. I'll sell all the land you want. I'll be like your inside man. As soon as he gets there, nah, never mind, I want to fight.
2 victories at the Battle of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. General Stephen Watts Kearny and his troops started to advance in the disputed territory and in New Mexico.
So Stephen Kearny, if you're familiar with the name Kearny, his nephew is Philip Kearny. I think it's pronounced Carney, who is going to lose an arm in the Mexican-American War. And then becomes an American Civil War general, might have ended up commanding the Army of the Potomac if he hadn't been killed at the Battle of Chantilly in 1862.
American troops encountered no Mexican forces when they arrived on August 15th. They entered Santa Fe and claimed the New Mexico territory for the United States without a single shot being fired. Kearny declared himself the military governor of the new territory on August 18th, and he established a civilian government. A temporary legal system was created, now known today as the Kearny Code. Kearny set out for California on September 25, 1846. In December of 1846, after the successful conquest of New Mexico, parts of Kearny's Army of the West moved into modern-day northwest Mexico. They were led by Alexander Doniphan, continuing what ended up being a year-long 5,500-mile campaign.
Crazy.
But in the territory, a rebellion happened.
And so think about all of this. I mean, this is vast territory. This is really big area. I mean, you don't really get the sense of that. But to drive it from, say, up here around the Arkansas River to drive down to the southern part of Texas, I mean, you're probably talking like 13, 14 hours driving today. So imagine how big all of this area is. It's populated by lots of different people. There are people of American descent. There are people of Native American descent. You've got a lot of like Apaches and Navajos and different Native American groups here. Of course, got Spanish and Mexican descent people with different ideas of who should be in charge and what this should look like. And it's pretty sparsely populated too, so you have large stretches of just nothing.
Known as the Taos Revolt. There were multiple separate skirmishes, but the U.S. military moved quickly to subdue the revolt. Meanwhile, the commander of the U.S. Navy's Pacific Squadron, John D. Sloat, had received orders to seize San Francisco Bay and blockade California Port. Captain John C. Fremont, leading a U.S. topographical expedition to survey the Great Basin, entered the Sacramento Valley in December 1845.
So Fremont will end up being the very first ever Republican nominee for president in 1856.
Fremont's party was at Upper Klamath Lake, Oregon Territory, when it received words that war between Mexico and the U.S. was imminent. The party then returned to California. On Sloat's orders, Fremont brought 160 volunteers to Monterey, in addition to the California Battalion. On July 15th, Sloat transferred his command of the Pacific Squadron to Commodore Robert F. Stockton, who was more militarily aggressive. General Castro and Governor Pio Pico wrote farewells and fled separately to the Mexican state of Sonora. Stockton's army entered Los Angeles unopposed on August 13th.
You're talking about small numbers. We're talking about hundreds of men that are conquering places like San Francisco and Los Angeles, large parts of California. That just goes to show you how few people are actually here and how little the military presence is for Mexico in some of these places. And the United States knows that, which is why they're able to take advantage of these situations. And it's only going to be in the immediate aftermath. Why are the San Francisco 49ers called the 49ers? It's because in 1849, you've got the gold rush beginning, and you've got thousands and thousands of people flooding west to take over, to kind of fill in this country, especially up in Northern California.
Point. He sent a report to the Secretary of State that California is entirely free from Mexican dominion. Meanwhile, U.S. Colonel Stephen W. Kearny had performed a march across New Mexico and the Sonoran Desert and crossed the Colorado River in late November 1846. On December 7th, 100 Lancers under General Andres Pico, brother of the governor, fought Kearny's army of about 150 at the Battle of San Pascual.
See what I mean? 100, 150. These are company-size units. They're so little, and there's a reason why we don't really remember any of these names the way we do names like Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor, because Taylor and Scott are going to be the ones leading the big armies. And again, by big armies, we're talking about units that are basically division size in the American Civil War, are these entire armies. But they're the ones that are going to get the headlines when you head to the south and you get to the actual fighting in Mexico.
The wounded Kearny pushed on until he had to establish a defensive position on a hill. General Pico kept the hill under siege until a 215-man American relief force arrived. A 600-man American force under Kearny began a 150-mile march to Los Angeles. On January 8, 1846, the Stockton-Kearny Army defeated the Mexican force in the 2-hour Battle of Rio San Gabriel. The Treaty of Cahuenga was signed, which marked the end of armed resistance in California. The conflict continued elsewhere. The Mexican army's defeats at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma caused even more political turmoil in Mexico. Led by Zachary Taylor, 2,300 U.S. troops crossed the Rio Grande and proceeded south. The hard-fought Battle of Monterey resulted in serious losses on both sides.
And this is one of those battles where you're going to have some pretty remarkable stuff happening. If you've seen the History Channel docudrama that they did on Ulysses S. Grant, this is where Grant is part of a unit that's surrounded and running low on ammunition, and the commander looks for a volunteer to go out and ask for help and get ammunition. And Grant is the quartermaster at this point, but he's been pushing for a combat command. He really wants to get out and fight. And he volunteers for this job. And Grant is a brilliant horseman. Like, he's really, really good on a horse, has been since childhood. And he does one of these things that is only for the movies, and this is why I think there needs to be a movie made about this guy, because his story's perfect for it. He does one of those deals where he goes out and he rides on the side of the horse to where you can't see him. All you see is the horse, so that he can't be shot off the horse. And he goes out and he gets the help that they need, and that happens at the Battle of Monterey. In the meantime, the United States is raising volunteer forces. The U.S. at this point has a very small army. So they're raising volunteers, and so you're going to get a bigger and bigger force as the war goes on in these couple of years. And that's why eventually you're going to get this second army under Winfield Scott that's going to land, and at that point the Mexicans are just going to be overwhelmed by numbers. And I should mention, too, that I know he said something about 2,300 men marching south with Taylor, but I think there are about 6,000 Americans at the Battle of Monterey. They're still outnumbered by the Mexican force, and the casualties end up pretty even. But as the war progresses, you're going to see that there's a distinct advantage And even when the numbers are equal on each side, the Americans are better equipped, better trained, or at the very least, better led. Taylor and Scott, in particular, are fantastic generals who lead well and outmaneuver the Mexican forces that they face, even when they're outnumbered.
The Mexican forces were under General Pedro de Ampudia, and they repulsed Taylor's best infantry. American soldiers were not familiar with urban warfare. They marched straight down the open streets and were caught by surprise by well-hidden Mexican defenders. Even though the Mexicans repulsed the Americans, General Taylor created an 8-week armistice with the Mexican army, allowing them to evacuate in return for the surrender of the city. Under pressure from Washington, Taylor broke the armistice and occupied the city of Saltillo. On February 22, 1847, Santa Anna personally marched north to fight General Taylor with 20,000 men. The 4,600 Americans had entrenched at a mountain pass called Buena Vista. The Mexicans suffered desertions on the way north and arrived with 15,000 men in a tired state. Knowing that his numbers were still superior, he demanded the surrender of the U.S. Army.
Imagine how many people must have been thinking about a little bit north of here, in San Antonio. You had Santa Anna with a vastly superior force surrounding the Alamo. Obviously, smaller numbers. Santa Ana's got maybe 4,000 men at the Alamo. The Alamo's got like 200, demanding their surrender, not getting it, wiping out the garrison. Not going to happen this time.
Was refused. Thus, he attacked the next morning. Santa Anna flanked the U.S. positions by sending his cavalry and some infantry up the steep terrain that made up one side of the pass, while a division of infantry attacked frontally along the road leading to Buena Vista. Being superior in numbers, the Mexicans had nearly broken the American lines at several points, but suffered heavily from the American horse artillery. Even though the initial reports of the battle, as well as some propaganda news, credited victory to the Mexicans, instead of attacking the next day, Santa Anna retreated, having heard word of a rebellion and upheaval in Mexico City.
And this is going to be reported in the United States as this great American victory. In fact, you're going to see people naming their children Buena Vista. I've got one in my own family. The niece of one of my ancestors who was born during this time period, born in the late 1840s. They named her Buena Vista Dodge. Just goes to show you how this stuff can be celebrated back home when people don't really know the details.
Some military historians agree that the U.S. Army probably would have been defeated if the Mexicans had gone through with their final attack. An important detail for the United States to have success in the war against Mexico was to secure its naval presence across Mexico's coasts. The U.S. Navy cleared the way for U.S. troops and supplies, especially to Mexico's main port of Veracruz.
And this is a deciding factor in this war, Mexico's inability to prevent the U.S. Navy from getting superiority on the seas and eventually using that then to land an additional army.
Even before hostilities began in the disputed northern region, the U.S. Navy had created a blockade. The U.S. president did not send reinforcements to Taylor's army for a continued advance. Instead, he sent a second army under General Winfield Scott. He transported to the port of Veracruz by sea to begin an invasion of the Mexican heartland. On March 9, 1847, Scott performs the first major amphibious landing in U.S. history in preparation for the siege of Veracruz. The city replied the best it could with its own artillery against the extended barrage, but because of the numerical superior force of the Americans, the Mexicans surrendered. The goal was obviously the capital. Scott marched westward to...
You can see here why they land a second army there. Number one, you've got the continued presence of Zachary Taylor's army in the north, which has to be guarded against. But the real threat to Mexico City then comes by the shortest route possible. You've got naval superiority. You can land here. You can supply with the port instead of having to go over long, difficult supply lines that could be attacked and harassed and stretched out. This is pretty obvious if you're looking at a map. This is the way to go if you can.
towards Mexico City with almost 9,000 troops on April 2nd, 1847. Santa Anna had set up a defensive position around the main road about 50 miles northwest of Veracruz at Cerro Gordo. Santa Anna had entrenched with 12,000 troops and artillery that were trained on the road, where he expected Scott to appear and catch him by surprise.
So this is one of those cool moments, especially if you're a Civil War buff, where if you look into the Battle of Cerro Gordo, or in some translations it's Sierra Gordo, you're going to have this young staff officer for Winfield Scott named PGT Beauregard, who's going to come up with a plan to win this battle. And very often these battles are won because of the plans of a captain or a lieutenant or a colonel. Same thing happens in World War I when you have these brilliant maneuvers made by the American forces going from Saint-Mihiel over to the attack for the Meuse-Argonne. And everyone knows about John J. Pershing, but they don't realize that the whole thing was planned by his staff officer, George C. Marshall, who is going to become the American Chief of Staff in World War II. So PGT Beauregard is involved in this. Robert E. Lee is a part of this. A number of other really prominent American Civil War generals are among his topographical engineers on Winfield Scott's staff, who go out and survey the area and give Scott the best intelligence possible, and that's going to lead him to win this incredible victory.
However, General Scott had sent 2,600 cavalry troops ahead. They reached the pass on April 12th, and the Mexican artillery fired upon them, revealing their positions. The Battle of Cerro Gordo started. The Americans won the battle and continued their advance, even though the guerrillas harassed the American troops with his remaining forces. And
I want to take a look just a little bit more at this Cerro Gordo battle because it doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Take a look at these numbers for a second. You've got relatively even forces. Americans anywhere from 9 to 12,000. Mexicans anywhere from 9 to 12,000. But look at the casualties. Americans, 63 killed, 368 wounded. Mexicans, 1,000 killed, 3,000 captured. I mean, you're talking 10 to 1 casualties. And this was all about the brilliance of the maneuver. This is about planning. This is about, just the ability that is shown by the American government. Santa Anna is caught off guard by the 4th Regiment of Illinois Volunteer Infantry, compelled to ride off without his artificial leg. He had lost a leg in previous action. His leg is captured by U.S. forces. They make songs about it. P.T. Barnum says that he acquired it for display in his museum. It was displayed in the Illinois State Military Museum in Springfield. A Mexican official was embarrassed seeing the trophy displayed, and it was removed. Cerro Gordo ends up Gordo, and you've got counties in Iowa, North Carolina, Illinois that are named after this, and you've got townships in other places. So big deal at the time. And I should mention too that the action in which Santa Anna lost his leg didn't happen in this war. It happened fighting the French in Veracruz several years earlier to this. So even then, you can see the importance of a place like Veracruz.
General Winfield Scott advanced on Mexico City. The capital was laid upon by a series of battles around the right flank of the city defenses. After the American victories at the Battle of Contreras and Battle of Churubusco, peace negotiations started, which broke down on September 6, 1847. With the subsequent battles of Molino del Rey and Chapultepec and the storming of the city gates,
Chapultepec,
the capital was occupied. Scott became military governor of occupied Mexico City. His victories in this campaign made him an American national hero.
They did.
Desertion.
But it's interesting that Zachary Taylor's the guy who's going to be elected president after all of this.
A major problem for the Mexican army, depleting forces on the eve of battle. Most soldiers were peasants who had loyalty to their village and family, but not to the generals who had conscripted them. Often hungry ill, under-equipped, only partially trained, and never well paid, the soldiers were held in contempt by their officers and had little reason to fight the Americans. Now that the US had gone far beyond the territorial gains it envisioned by invading central Mexico with its dense population, the question was raised whether to annex Mexico itself.
I was going to say, I mean, that's a legitimate question to be had at this point. Is it, are we going to keep fighting Mexico over territory, or are we just going to take it all? And it was decided that was probably not in the best interest of the United States to take it all. But we will take what we want of all of this.
But many oppose this idea due to cultural differences, overextension, and the huge instability this would cause. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave the U.S. control of Texas, Alta California, and Nuevo Mexico.
So Alta California being what we call California, because then you have Baja California down here.
Territories were organized in other states over time. In return, Mexico received $15 million, an approximation of just $443 million today, which was less than half the amounts the US had attempted to offer Mexico before. The areas were sparsely populated, and that is probably the reason for such a low cost for the US. With Texas and the secession from Mexico, the U.S. gained more than 900,000 square miles of land.
Huge.
The Gadsden Purchase was another acquisition for the United States and fixed the current border between Mexico and the USA.
All right, that was really good. I think there's a lot that we can learn by studying what was going on at this time. And like I said, if you really want to just see how important the Mexican-American War was in terms of the experience it gave future Civil War officers, check out my video that's pinned down in the comment below that is just me going through the Mexican-American rosters and pointing out all of these guys who fought side by side as captains and lieutenants and sometimes even majors and colonels. That these guys that would eventually fight against each other just 15 years later in the American Civil War, or less than 15 years later. So that was good stuff from Knowledgia. The link is in the description to the original content as well. I want to thank Christine in New York City and William in Rushville, Indiana for your support on Patreon. Thank you so much. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.